Hi, this is Toby. Thanks for downloading this episode of the Science for Policy podcast. It's been a while, thankfully, since I've had to give one of my little introductions to apologise for audio quality. We've got quite good now, after 60-something episodes, at making good quality recordings at both ends for myself and the guest. But occasionally our best efforts fail and we have to rely on our backup systems, and that's what happened here. It's a really good conversation with a really interesting world-leading expert, marred by, unfortunately, the occasional audio blip, which I hope is easy to overlook. Sorry about that. And on with the show. Hello, welcome to the Science for Policy podcast. My name's Toby, and today I'm joined by Professor Jan-Pieter Krahnen. Professor Krahnen is founding director emeritus of the Leibniz Institute for Financial Research, SAFE, Sustainable Architecture for Finance in Europe, that's the name of the institute, and Professor Emeritus of Finance at Goethe University's House of Finance. He has extensive experience in advising policymakers on how to regulate financial markets, including at European level as a member of the high-level expert group on structural reforms of the EU banking sector, and as an advisor to the European Securities and Markets Agency, not to mention several other prominent advisory roles in Germany. So, Jan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. Hello, Toby.
Hello. I have to say I quite enjoy the German habit of naming universities and research institutes after famous researchers. You've collected Leibniz and Goethe yourself. That's not bad. I think perhaps you only need Einstein to complete the full set.
No, but this connection is very real and very intensive. And actually, if you know about this Leibniz Institute, it grew out of the university, almost like an offspring, but institutionally and funding-wise, it's now independent, but keeps close bridges to the university. So research is an important basis for that institute, and that maybe links also to policy work quite nicely.
Yeah, so the university can trace its origins back to Leibniz, right?
No, the other way around. The university was here, and Leibniz, the name of a large number of research centers around Germany, all over Germany, in many disciplines. And we happen to be one in economics, and we only joined that club, if I may call it that way, like 2 years ago, and are fairly a new startup, if you wish, in the academic world.
Yeah, great. Well, then let's talk about the work you do. The main theme of this podcast, of course, is scientific advice for policy, which doesn't always mean natural sciences, of course, but it does tend to mean sciences that have a certain degree of, a claim of generality. And you've advised policymakers on financial issues, so especially market regulation. And I'd really like to understand whether you think that is all part of the same stuff, that's just another kind of science advice, or whether there are analogies or overlaps between what you do and the other stuff. My first, I'm sure, quite naive and clumsy question, which I hope you can finesse in an answer, is to ask, what kind of advice do you give? So scientists bring to the table, bodies of knowledge and theory based on scientific investigation. So when you, as an economist, engage with policymakers, what do you bring to the table? Is it the same or something different?
So we are basically backed up by our own research with our experiences on particular fields of the economy, and that's financial markets. That's the functioning of particular elements in financial markets. To give you an example that relates to the global financial crisis a few years ago, I have been working a lot on structured finance, which is a particular financial product that has been at the start of the financial crisis becoming of great importance. And there wasn't that much research at that time. But anyway, we are doing research on financial products. And then when a crisis happens that has something to do with such a product, we can use that information in, let's say, trying to develop remedies, trying to develop strategies, how to deal with the ensuing problem. So that's the scientific basis. You have some research that relates to the problem. You try to take all your, let's say, your common sense in a way to apply it to a situation which always is slightly different from the situation you might have studied in the lab or in empirical research before.
Okay, great. And the way you describe it, it sounds like basically troubleshooting very often. So a problem comes along, the policymaker needs to understand how to solve it. They don't have that at their fingertips, and so they turn to you for advice.
No, I think troubleshooting is the way how you get recognized in policy circles, right? So there is a situation, a crisis. They look around. Is there anybody who has done anything on this? And you can basically put up your hand and say, well, I have an idea. That might be an explanation why we are in trouble. Maybe you can solve it this way, that way. And policymakers may take your advice or not, because you are not the only person to give an advice. So there's a competition of advisors for attention. And that's when you get, in a way, recognized. And later, afterwards, you may have more general comments on how legislation, how regulation should develop. And you will, as I did, accompany a process of re-regulation as after the financial crisis over many years with some basic tools, some basic ideas in mind. And you always keep on pushing policymakers to respect or to remember a certain idea or advice in the retooling of the regulatory framework.
And if I could ask a little more about the research that your advice is based on, what kind of research is this?
So I think the research I am doing, or we were doing in an institute like ours, is truly academic research, in a sense that you basically initially abstract from a particular troubling situation or problematic situation, but really try to understand how a certain regulatory rule, for instance, impacts on the behavior of, let's say, investors or firms or banks. And so that you can generalize the relationship between a particular tool or regulation and the outcome that you observe in markets. So, and that is in my eyes, in the eyes of our profession, this is scientific work. It also follows the rules of science, which is you try to be very transparent about the data you use. You explain your models. You have to prove, so to speak, the statements you are doing. And then you try to come out with empirical work, which is analysis of data with theory in mind that you can replicate, that others can replicate. You publish in journals. You are peer reviewed in what you do. So all this is scientific and leads to scientific papers, which are not the same as the advice you might give at some, but they are the basis. Your reputation builds on that, and your knowledge and your understanding builds on that.
Yeah, it makes sense. You mentioned one important factor in the success of this kind of policy advice work, which is basically being in the right place at the right time and being the right person, having the knowledge that is needed at the time when it's needed. Are there other factors, do you think, that affect how successfully your advice lands with policymakers, factors that can be kind of generalized?
Yeah, if I can expand on what you just said, I think an important aspect is that you can convey to policymakers the idea of being independent. And I think this is the most important consequence of doing scientific research as a living in an institution which is not really in one way or the other financially linked to different interest groups in that particular case. So if you have, let's say, if you are closely in terms of funding associated, let's say, to the financial industry, be it the fund industry, be it banking, and then you come up with regulatory advice on some issue, policymakers who don't follow all the details of your argument necessarily might always be suspicious that you may be driven by other motives than those that have to do with your research. And I think I would say now, in looking back on the last 15 years, maybe the most important, let's say, asset that I could use in my work was to say, well, I'm not speaking for a particular group. I'm not behind a particular interest group, but I try to, let's say, to orient my statements on welfare of the society, of members of society. I say, I don't say I always get that, but that's basically our motivation when we are purely based in an academic world. So, and that is an advantage if people ask for your advice. I have frequently or repeatedly had the situation that I offered some idea and the counterparts, which were policymakers, asked, okay, so who is standing behind you? Who funds your work? Who funds your institution? And when I could say, well, this is basically a public university that I'm working for, it's funded with let's say, competitive scientific money, competitively earned scientific money, you were in a better position to be heard as if I would have said, well, this or that is my funding source, which is also happens to be one of the parties in a certain conflict, be they investors or workers or entrepreneurs.
That's interesting. Okay. Well, I mean, okay, that makes perfect sense, of course. This idea of being independent, I'm sure you know, is very strongly emphasized by science advisors of all stripes in all domains. But from what you've just said, it sounds like this independence from vested interest, let's put it that way, is kind of something of a competitive advantage for you, which then implies that there are would-be advisors on financial issues who can't demonstrate independence in that way. You perhaps have other funding streams or are employed by commercial organizations or whatever, and whom policymakers are less inclined to trust for that reason. And that's interesting. I mean, I don't think I often hear it talked about quite that way. I mean, in other areas of science, I'd say there isn't so much a competitive advantage to being independent, but rather there's just like a clear line, or at least there's supposed to be. Scientific advice is really only acceptable at all if it is demonstrably independent. And if it's not, then it counts as advocacy or something else. So do I take from what you've just said that there isn't such a clear line in your field of work?
Yeah, I think there is not such a clear line. And there are many people. I mean, one of the first insights that I had when I started to be more active on the policy side was that it is in a way easy to have a voice. So many people have voices. So there are many voices in the room, many papers, many advisors, many advices given. But the art, the challenge is to get into the ear of the policymaker. So the ear is the problem, not the voice. Right? And originally, when I started all this, I thought, well, you just have to write a nice op-ed or a nice policy paper where everything is true and important and everybody will immediately recognize it. But that's not the case. Because from the reader's point, from the other side of the hedge, so to speak, from the policymaker's point of view, they cannot easily distinguish, let's say, independent advice from biased advice. How can you do this? If they could do this easily, they wouldn't need it in the first place. They wouldn't need it in the first place, right? So, and since that is so, and since there are so many voices coming from all sorts of organizations, lobby groups, and so forth, this is, I think, the hardest, also for policymakers to make this distinction.
So, how do you help them make that distinction?
Oh, yeah, well, it is, in a certain sense, it's never true that you are fully independent. This is a bit of a misnomer. So I wouldn't claim there is nothing that biases me, my perception in my argument. So that would be a bit making the point too strong. But there is no obvious interest group that will let me bend my thinking, my argument in a particular direction. Right? At least I try always to be very transparent about my funding, about my roles and so forth, because I figured out that this matters to be seriously heard also across party lines. Right? So if you're in a country like Germany, where you have typically not one party ruling and the rest tiny opposition groups, but many parties rule, you have coalitions, you have to convince several people beyond the party lines. And they all have to take your argument serious and really read to it and don't put it easily in a certain bucket and say, oh, this is this argument or that argument that comes always with this party or that party. So, for instance, I have always tried to talk to all parties, not literally to all, but to those that we would consider in the inner part of the democratic spectrum. I always spoke to all those people who were willing to listen to me or to discuss with me.
Yeah, so this is a big deal. So what you're describing is that I mean, someone in your field of work doesn't just have their academic expertise, their subject expertise. They have an awful lot of other skills and expertise, for instance, in navigating political landscapes.
Yeah, I think this is very important, that you have to unlearn academic speech so in the very early phase of policy advisory work, also from my side, but from colleagues as well, the idea was, I have a working paper or a published paper even, which is of course an academic paper, but it has all the important aspects in it that you would need to solve a particular policy problem. So you throw this paper at policymakers and say, here it is. You can go through the paper. When you understand it, once you understand it, you will immediately see that it solves your problem. But this is not the way communication works. So you have to learn to speak a language and to use channels that policymakers can and are willing to digest. And so that is an exercise a bit along the lines that I said earlier. You have to find the ear of the policymaker. And finding the ear is much more difficult than finding your own voice.
And do policymakers know that they need this advice? So I tell you why I'm asking, because it seems to me, or at least I've been told, that an awful lot of politicians and more generalist policymakers have some level of training and education in economics. It's like quite a common academic route through which people make it into government, right? And I was talking to a guest last summer. It was Michael Bang-Petersen in Denmark, who specializes in psychology and behavioral sciences. And there was an issue he perceived that policymakers often feel that they have like an instinctive understanding of how people think. We are all people. We all understand people on a basic level. Plus, they often had some kind of, as it were, pop psychology 101. And he mentioned economics as part of that, right? So he found that persuading politicians and policymakers that they can benefit from expert advice in that area, making them realize they even need it, can be a hard sell.
Yes and no. So that's not a very good answer. But so yes, in a sense of many of the aspects that have to do with finance are pretty complicated and complex, often require, let's say, second or third round effects on particular instruments and measures that are not really part of the common debate or common discourse. So even if people have a training in economics, often in politics it's macroeconomics that people have some training of. This is not the same as what we do in finance. So we are really, and I personally in my work are concentrating on on advice on financial issues. So this always brings in the issue of financial markets, the pricing of financial markets, which is a rather opaque thing for many people. And I think this brings an extra degree of, let's say, complexity that you not always find in the thinking of people, even if they have an economic background. What is more difficult, I think, is to make people aware that they are not fully understanding the situation. So they often think we have it fully, we understand how it is. So you can make as an example, you can talk about green finance, where everybody says, well, we now want to push the economy on a transition phase, and we as investors want to be part of that. So we only invest in green assets or something like that. And you need a deeper financial understanding to understand whether this action has really the impact that it's intended to have. And so for that, you sometimes have to tell policymakers, listen, the intention is really good. Your intention is wonderful, and I subscribe to it. But the path you are taking, the type of instrument you're using, is not delivering on this for this and this and this reason. Right? And that's where, and when this is heard and understood, then only the ear opens up for an idea.
Right. But you already have to be in the room to have that kind of conversation. And there has to be a match between what the policymaker needs and thinks they need and what you have to offer. So to go to a policymaker and say, hey, this idea, this thing that you're committed to and you've invested in and you're plowing on with and you think you're doing okay at, well, actually, you know what, stop, because it might not work, and here's why. That's got to be one of the hardest modes of science advice to make effective, because you're not responding to a need, or at least a need they're aware of. You're trying to kind of wedge yourself in where there isn't a science advice shaped hole.
Absolutely. I mean, policymakers are not there to question their ideas all the time. Right? It's not there. They are not in a debate club, nor are they trying to win an argument challenge, an Oxford-style debate, so to speak. They want to deliver. And if they have found a story that they find convincing, they go for it. So if you want to settle, stop a while, wait for a minute, let us really think through whether this is the best way to achieve your instrument. You need this time of reflection. And I would say what is needed for making people reflect on issues, besides their ability and willingness to stop for a short while, is trust. You need to have a trusted relationship with these persons beforehand. So when you try to establish trust in the moment where they have a problem, this is too late. They will only refer to people they, in a way, had some contact with and some positive vibration or remembrance remained. So that's why I have built my work a lot around networks that can grow over time, and that have a lot to do of being willing to talk to people under circumstances where there is no actual need for advice, but there is an opportunity to talk. This is in itself not easy to manage, but you can organize that. And later, when the problem arises, they may remember you and say, wasn't there this person? We had a good conversation. He was listening to my arguments. He made suggestions that I could use later on. Now, why not talk to this person? It's a bit like in finance, we speak a lot about relationship lending as a long-lasting financial relationship that banks are pursuing, where private information is collected, and it's quite similar. A policy relationship also, a relationship between, let's say, academics or would-be advisors and the clientele often develops around innocent situations where you meet these people, you talk to them, but you establish sort of a feeling, I can listen to that person. He will not screw me or want to push me in a particular direction. That's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Great. I do want to ask you about the very common distinction that science advisors make between providing evidence and providing policy recommendations. The question is basically like, is evidence everything, or is there more? And some science advisors will say that their role is entirely to provide the evidence, hopefully, well packaged and presented in a way that's clear why and how it's relevant and so on. But then it's the job of the policymaker to work with that evidence in any way they see fit, to construct policy changes that are needed. And others will say, no, concrete policy recommendations are valuable and part of the science advisor's job too. So I read into what you say so far that a lot of what you do is really very applied indeed. You're presenting policymakers not only with evidence, but also with concrete solutions to their specific problems.
Yeah, well, we also present them with evidence. This is part of developing an argument. So, if I think about, let's say, if we can speak about green finance, for instance, where the idea is investors are offered particular portfolios to invest in, and then because they do so, they somehow trigger a faster transition into a more carbon-free environment. So this can be backed up with academic work. So you can show, well, if people invest in a particular product, and many people do so, like following a green strategy, how does this change relative prices in markets? So does your portfolio composition that is green have any impact on the relative prices of green and brown assets and their cost of capital? And if you can establish this as an empirical finding, you can use this in your argument. So the argument will not simply present this evidence and say, you have to chew on this bone now and find out what it means. But the policy advice would say, well, this means that this and this labeling of green product is probably falsely labeled as such, because the impact that you are selling to clients and where they pay a price for isn't happening. It cannot be demonstrated. Or it could be the converse, that you show it's working well, and this type of strategy deserves the label that it's sustainable finance or green finance or something like that. And the argument is in substance a scientific argument, but you take the next step, which is what does it imply for regulatory work?
But I guess because of the nature of the areas that you work on, those areas are themselves engaging with policy. Like it's like political science in that way. The very subject matter of your research is policy and its effects.
Well, no, the academics, let's say publications, the world of they are far away from policymakers. So they are just, so for instance, if you go into finance journals, you have a long list of them, and they are completely away from policy in a sense that they try to establish causality between certain instruments and certain results, and try to show that this is true in particular markets, countries, by using good data, or maybe over longer periods of time, or globally, whatever the problem is. But that is a literature and I'd say a discussion in itself that is far away from policymakers. And is in a way is different also because one thing that distinguishes a lot of scientific work that's in the sciences from what we do in economics is this behavioral component that you mentioned already. So that if you have an insight, the people in the market, in the economy, will also learn this insight and will adjust their behavior, which is less so in the science, right? So if you make a model about how certain viruses are behaving, they are not learning this and you are understanding and embedding it in their own behavior. They behave as they are programmed, basically. But if you are in an economic environment, in financial markets, nobody is programmed. All are learning all the time. And if I have an insight that some strategies have a certain effect or impact, then, and I publish that, then market participants immediately use this information and change their behavior. So that makes it, I think, challenging, I would say, to come up with general rules.
No kidding. So I feel like I would not be let off the hook very easily if I did ask you at least a bit about 2008. And I'm sure this is a topic you're thoroughly well rehearsed on, if not thoroughly bored of. So I apologize for bringing it up, but I do think it's important to bring it up. Because the global financial crash of 2008 is so often held up as an example of the failure of academic financial expertise making it into policy. You know, all this sophisticated scholarship and somehow you still didn't see your stuff coming. What's the point? Is that fair?
Well, I think this is unfair, right? Because and so let me give my own account, right? Why the whole financial crisis started at one particular identifiable spot, and that has to do with structured finance, with the use of particular financial products that were, when they were constructed, conceived as being very safe and sound, and actually a fantastic instrument for banks to share risks with other participants in the market, right? And that was advocated even by big policymakers. Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Fed in the US at the time, was a very well-known advocate of structured finance as the new standard for financial institutions to use risk-sharing instrument. And that the world, because of this increased risk-sharing, has become a safer place, was an often heard claim by central bankers around the world. So that's why they were also very relaxed about the long, almost silent situation in financial markets in the run-up to the crisis. What we found out much later was that the analytical understanding of these products, these structured finance products on bank balance sheets by central banks and supervisory agencies was much less present than at least we in academia thought. So at the time, the exchange data-wise and model-wise between central banks and academia wasn't that intense as it is today. And so I did research on this structured finance things, found out certain details before the crisis, which if I would have understood that they generalize to the behavior of everybody, would have in a way allowed me to predict that there is a crisis looming. But I didn't do this step. So although I knew the little things that went wrong afterwards, I always thought these are small exceptions to the rule. And the rule is different. Right? The rule is, as Greenspan said, it's a risk-sharing instrument that stabilizes the world. But the truth was differently, and we only found out later. And so in that sense, that you could say there was a lack of coordinated wisdom. And that's why we didn't see it earlier. And I would now say there was a lack of, I would say, critical research on statements made by public authorities. And I kept this in mind. If people stand up and say, this and this is a safe way to go somewhere, I would now be more willing to question that and say, could you please give a full explanation why this is safe? And then I would ask, do you really have the data that makes you believe and make this statement like an academic statement, where you have all the data, you know the models, you do the analysis in a transparent way, people can replicate? Only then I trust such a statement. The world is safer or even unsafer as it was some other time ago. So that would be my first attempt. So did we fail as academics? Yeah, I would say in a certain way we did, but it was I would say a shared responsibility of the captains on the financial ships and the academic world around them.
Okay, yeah. So the implication is not that this kind of advice is useless. It's that this kind of advice is essential. And if it had worked properly, then the outcome would have been better.
Yeah, I mean, what came after, when the crisis happened, then I think it was the high time of research to try quickly to understand what the main reasons are. So, of course, the overnight rescue operations by central banks and governments, they were in a way without alternative, right? So they had to do it, and there was no academic wisdom. But a few weeks later, the first studies have been done, the first thinking has been done, the first debate exchange between bankers and academics has happened, and quickly emerged, let's say, a set of possible reasons for this crisis. Also, why it basically was so contagious. It happened in one spot, but in a very short while, the consequences were felt all over the globe in many institutions, even in banks that believed to be very regional, far away, like the Landesbank in Eastern Germany, where everybody thought this is a very Eastern Germany thing, suddenly collapsed because of a bombshell that exploded thousands of kilometers away, right, which was Lehman. Right? And so there were connections that people didn't know about before. So after that, of course, a new generation of research and so forth was generated on the one side, but also, I would say, analytical thinking, how we can avoid that in the future. So what was really the weak moment that destroyed so many banks after the Lehman crisis, and that, I think, advised the regulator quite a bit. So there was a positive impact of research on policy making after the financial crisis, not before.
Yeah, interesting. So you might imagine I'm kind of equally fatigued, I suppose, with talking about the COVID-19 pandemic in these kinds of conversations, because, of course, as people say accurately, the pandemic was a watershed moment for science advice. Suddenly everyone was talking about how science advice interacts with policy making and how that relationship should work. And an awful lot has changed and developed and become clearer and, I think, improved since then. So a lot of what you just described from 2008 happened in 2020 in other fields, especially, I think, the structural stuff. The institution, policymakers suddenly realizing they didn't have the connections they needed to get the advice they needed really quickly. And so having to kind of improvise and shoot from the hip from the very beginning, more or less successfully, without relying on evidence, while they also cast about desperately to try and get the connections and the people on board that they needed to go forward.
Yeah, and I mean, this was in the pandemic, there were focused research centers that did for years and maybe decades of work on exactly that topic. I mean, they didn't work on COVID, but on pandemic, on viruses. And they could immediately be activated. So there was, in Germany, there is this one RKI, there is a certain leading institute that is even a central institute of the government, if you wish, of the state, that coordinates research efforts across the country, that has, in a way, a speaker role for these competencies and would be immediately activated in this. And that worked, I think, very well. In the financial crisis, there was nothing like this. So in a way, the research center that I have been helped to set up after the crisis is a response to this. So if there is a next financial crisis, we hopefully have some, let's say, informed people in that institute that will be happy and prepared to think quickly about remedies, or even in the run-up to give warnings that something of that sort might happen again.
And this is possible and compatible, you think, with the kind of strong emphasis on independence that you mentioned at the start of our conversation?
The more independent you are, or try to be, there is a downside to this, right? So the very independent are also not very well connected, because that defines their independence. But this means also that they are not very well informed in many cases. So with proximity to the financial markets, to the financial industry, comes information, comes understanding, but also comes dependence, right? And so there is a balance. So I wouldn't say maximize independence, and you may maximize not understanding well what's going on. You may be completely independent, but it may be more or less common sense what you say and no more. I can make this example also with respect to the research we did prior to the financial crisis. We had research project with all the banks in Germany on the way they dealt with structured finance products. So in order to make this happen, you need to be, I wouldn't say good friend, but you need to be friendly to these institutions so that you provide you with the data, that you have a good research surrounding. And of course, that makes you be connected to all these institutions beforehand. And then when the crisis comes, you basically have to free yourself of these connections and say, I think this and this went wrong. And there is, so the effort that I put in was not so much in condemning one institution or the other, but was really building a new regulatory framework that is hindering the repetition of such a situation. So the situation was, large banks have so little equity that when there is a problem, the state has to bail them out or risk a major disruption in the economy because this bank suddenly disappears, which really gives financing to thousands and millions of companies. And so that's like a hold up situation of the banks vis-a-vis the state, and you want to avoid that. And that was then I say our because many people worked on this field, but certainly for me, the main hypothesis: how do we minimize the hold up risk in financial institutions vis-a-vis the state?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I asked about the compatibility of independence. So you can perform that role despite the connections you have built up over time with the industry.
Yeah, well, in some sense, I disconnected that. So that was that. Then you have to, because what we suggested was not really in the interest of most of these financial institutions, asking them to hold more equity. So I didn't become a big friend of the financial industry thereafter. Also not a big enemy, but I mean, it was basically I would say, the talk of the town, the talk of Europe, that we want to to go away from these hold-up situations, these bailout situations. I think the main insight that we could provide early on from the academic side was to say, you need a special insolvency code for large banks. Large banks are different from large corporations, other corporations like car companies or so, because this interconnection under the carpet that you can't see, that goes via financial contracts in a very subtle way, are so heavy that you have to rethink our insolvency regime that we have developed over centuries or over decades in most countries, and make one that is special for these type of interconnected institutions. And I think that was more or less an academic drive to do this. And then also, I think academic research helped to think through what these interdependencies really mean and how you can deconstruct them or how you can control them, make them transparent, make them manageable.
Yeah. Well, I want to say thank you very much indeed. I wasn't kidding at the start when I said my questions would be naive and clumsy, but you've really been very enlightening in response, not to mention frank and open and a very enjoyable conversation partner. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much, Professor Jan-Pieter Krahnen.
Thank you, Toby. It was a pleasure talking to you.
The Science for Policy podcast is created by Sapea. It's produced by me, Toby Wardman, with additional research and support from Agnieszka Pietrczuk. Sapea is a consortium of Europe's academy networks representing more than 100 academies, young academies and learning societies from more than 40 countries across Europe. We're part of the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism, and as such we're funded by the European Union. Having said that, the opinions you hear on this podcast are those of the guests, and sometimes mine, but certainly not the views of the European Commission. This music is composed by Carlo Alfredo Piatti and performed by Elizaveta Sushchenko, and this last bit is particularly good.